Good afternoon, FYE. This is a short video that's part of the acculturation activities in FYE. We're going to use this video to cover something that is really, really important at Lenoir-Rhyne University, and that is how to read. I can hear you thinking right now, well, I already know how to read, so I'm going to skip this one. Don't, because this is a little bit more than how to read. It is how to read the things you read in college. Even that may seem a little bit funny because, what do you read in college? Well, you read books. But if you think about it, you read lots of different kinds of books. For instance, one type of book that you might read is a textbook. We're going to pull this textbook over here. But that's not the only kind of book that you might read. There are going to be other times when your professors ask you to read something that's not really a textbook, but that isn't really a novel or a piece of fiction either. It might be a nonfiction book that is an argument, something that you need to understand. Another type of reading. Peer-reviewed journal articles probably fall into this category too, although they don't usually have such a pretty cover. And then, of course, there are novels. We've read two of these in FYE already, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime and The Secret Garden. The thing is that each of these different types of reading will require different reading strategies from you. And it's important to be able to recognize what it is that that you're being asked to read, and probably more importantly, why does my professor want me to read it? And I paused for a long time to write that out because this is the most important question. Why am I being asked to read this? If you stop and think about it, you can look at a book like this, Infants, Children, and Adolescents, and probably pretty quickly figure out that this is a textbook. And usually when you're assigned readings from a textbook, or even when they're not assigned but recommended, the purpose is for information. On the other hand, if we have a book like this is not really a textbook, this is an argument. And instead of reading it just for information, like factual information, you're reading it to understand the author's perspective. And finally, we have something like this, a novel, that might be for entertainment, but I would argue, more likely in a college kind of a setting, it's designed to help you have empathy for a certain type of person by experiencing their fictional existence, which means that this is not real or true. One of the first things that you should do when you're confronted with a textbook is to look at the table of contents. And I've given you a picture of the table of contents here. You should notice a couple of things with this. You should notice that it's arranged in chapters, or sections actually, and that within each section there are individual chapters. Those chapters should give you a good overview of what's going to be covered in this book. You can tell here that this particular book gives us theories of research about child development, then some foundational concepts, then it moves into the specifics of various periods in a child's life. Another very useful feature of textbooks is that they usually have an index at the very back that will allow you to look up concepts and find what page the concept is covered under. For instance, if we wanted to know about adjustment problems, we could look up adjustment problems, and then we could see all of the different things that might cause adjustment problems or be related to them. So children with aggression and adjustment problems, we would want to go to page 386 to look that up. This can be very useful when you have a term that you need to know, but you don't remember where it is in your textbook. There's an art to reading textbooks. It's more than just picking it up and reading every single word that's in the book. In fact, if I'm reading a textbook, the first thing that I'm going to do is to kind of scan through it and see what I notice. So here's a picture of the inside of this book, and you can see that it's arranged with major headings, the field of child development, but then subheadings, periods of development, domains of development. And if I flip the page, this continues, and then you can see another major subheading, basic issues, continuous or discontinuous development. Scanning these headings and subheadings will give you a broad overview of what's going to be covered. From there, then you can go back and start reading, paying attention to key concepts, bulleted lists, etc. The one thing you want to avoid doing is this. I'm sure you have all seen textbooks where someone has taken a highlighter and just highlighted everything in the book. That's not helpful. You want to be looking for highlighting key concepts, as has been done right here, outlining what experts have identified as the major periods of development in a child's life. That will give you a guide then when you come back to study to know this is material that you need to learn. Whereas if you have just highlighted everything, you really don't have much to go on. So key thing here, pay attention to the way the information is organized. Look for bulleted lists, look for bold. These are the types of information. This is the way a textbook has of showing you what information is important. Another way that a textbook has of doing this is through the use of tables and images. You should, if you're paying attention, go, oh, basic issues in child development. That corresponds to this heading over here, and I bet you that what is in this table is kind of a summary of the major issues that are covered in this longer section of text. By paying attention to these kinds of organizational strategies in a textbook, you're going to identify what's really important, and you're going to make your life a whole lot easier rather than trying to read every single word in this book and remember every single word in this book. It's not going to happen. So textbooks, key things to keep in mind, and I'll jot these down for you. 1, preview it. 2, look for big concepts. 3, pay attention to tables, figures, etc. And 4, highlight, but only the important stuff. If you work with these strategies, your reading with textbooks will be much, much better. Reading other types of books, like this text, Poetic Justice by Martha Nussbaum, will require different reading strategies. This is not a book that is just about giving us information, facts that scholars have agreed upon. Instead, this is a book in which Martha Nussbaum attempts to convince us of something, to show us a certain way of thinking. She's making an argument, and our job in reading this is to understand her argument. So to help you see how that might work, I have taken a photograph of the first page of the preface of this particular book, and I've showed you how I dealt with it. In reading through this, I identified a few things as kind of key ideas at the beginning. You can see here that I've underlined this. Whitman's call for public poetry, I believe, is as pertinent to our time as it was to his. So Nussbaum is wanting us to think about poetry and why it's important. Okay, so I've read that, and I keep reading, and then I get to this statement. The purpose of this book. This is a classic case of signal words. You should pay attention to those. When you see a writer say something like, the purpose of this is, that's a key moment in the book that you should be looking for. The purpose of this book is to describe the ingredient of public discourse that Whitman found missing from his America and to show some roles it still might play in our own. It grows out of the conviction, which I share with Whitman, that storytelling and literary imagination are not opposed to rational argument, but can provide essential ingredients in a rational argument. So now that I've found the signal word, I've identified the following two sentences as being important. But you can see that in order for me to make sense of this, I've got to do more than just identify that these are important. I've got to summarize and put it in my own words. So I drew a line, and then up at the top of the page, kind of summarized. What is she saying? Well, the purpose is to show why storytelling adds to our rational arguments. So now I've got that as a record there. That's the first step in understanding. This is the main purpose of the book. Everything else that comes after that is going to be her explanation of why she thinks that this is true. And as I read, I will underline in a similar way. Again, not underlining everything, but underlining those key concepts and summarizing, when I need to, the complex points that she's making. This is quite a different kind of reading than information gathering. It is reading to understand an argument. And then there's fiction, novels. Some of you may not ever read novels again after this course, but many of you will. It's important to think about the question of, why am I reading this? And as I mentioned before, I think a key piece of this is empathy, to understand the characters. And again, this requires a different kind of reading than we saw either with textbooks or with arguments. So how do you go about reading a novel? Well, I've photocopied for you, or photographed, the first page of this, and I'll show you how I would approach this. As I'm reading this, my question is, who is speaking? This is the very first page. So I'm wondering, who is speaking, and what is this person like? And as I read this, it was 7 minutes after midnight. That's really precise. I don't know about you, but I normally would not say it's 7 minutes after midnight. I would say it's about midnight. The dog was lying on the grass in the middle of the lawn in front of Mrs. Shears's house. Its eyes were closed. It looked as if it was running on its side, the way dogs run when they think they are chasing a cat in a dream. But the dog was not running or asleep. The dog was dead. I don't know why, but that seems important to me, so I would probably underline it. There was a garden fork sticking out of the dog. The points of the fork must have gone all the way through the dog and into the ground because the fork had not fallen over. This seems like a strange detail to me. And I would probably take note of that. I decided that the dog was probably killed with the fork because I could not see any other wounds in the dog, and I do not think you would stick a garden fork into a dog after it had died for some other reason, like cancer, for example, or a road accident. Now, my observation here would be, again, this is very precise, and it seems to state the obvious. As we read on, we realize that these are a lot of the characteristics of what Christopher is like. He is a very precise person. He does tend to focus on strange details. And part of the reading process is to pay close attention to the way that the language is used. And you should note, that's a very different question than we would ask about a textbook. Probably we don't ask about the nuances of language in a textbook in the same way that we do about a novel. So when we're reading fiction, it's a very different kind of reading. It's paying attention to the details. It's listening to who the characters are. And it's paying close attention to the language itself. And it's that kind of reading that will reward you when you're reading fiction. Again, quite different from the other forms of reading. So with that in mind, I think it's important to note that there are going to be other types of reading. And the questions that you should always be asking are, first, what type of writing am I reading? Is it a textbook? Is it an argument? Is it fiction? Is it poetry? Why am I reading it? Am I reading it to get information? Am I reading it to empathize with characters? Am I reading it to understand an argument? Am I reading it to appreciate a certain philosophical kind of thought? These are all different reasons why you might be reading it. And then ask, what are the appropriate strategies for this type of reading? Knowing what you're reading and why you're reading it and what are good strategies for doing so will help you out in college and in the rest of your life in all sorts of ways. So good luck with it. Hope that this was helpful.